truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024, the 1,322nd day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at I'mYourModerator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so I hope everybody had a lovely extended weekend. I hope you enjoyed the podcast yesterday, the interview with my friend, the novelist, screenwriter, and cultural critic Bret Easton Ellis from back in the early summer of 2020. Before listening to it yesterday, I hadn't listened to it since 2020, so I didn't know what it was going to be like. and I was pleased to hear that it held up pretty well. All right, so we were kind of in a dead zone for news over the weekend, from like Friday afternoon till Monday afternoon. It seemed like virtually nothing happened. We heard for days about Venezuelan migrants taking over apartments in Colorado. And of course, I understand that illegal immigration is an enormous issue, but I think everybody kind of gets it by now, right? I mean, this story will have the intended impact on the people it's for, and maybe a major impact, but it's not for us. We know that illegal immigration is a problem, and that immigration to this country, when it's happening, has to be controlled. We know that despite our soft-hearted wishes that everyone in the world was a good person who only wanted a better life and would never do anything wrong, some people aren't like that. That's true of Americans just as it's true of foreigners. But knowing that, you gotta vet the foreigners if they're gonna live here. Because if you're not doing that, then you might increase the number of really, really bad people by an awful lot. And you know that in addition to the destabilization and the cheap and controllable labor, the other reason for the slave trade that's been ongoing at our southern border is for their political power. And the fact that the Uniparty wants to make these illegal aliens U.S. citizens and wants to give them the vote so they can somehow substantiate the ridiculous number of ballots that they'll tell us were cast for whoever Donald Trump's opponent ends up being, if indeed we have a fake election at all. And we have to remember all of these things right now, because at the end of the month, we're going to have another government shutdown possibility as they negotiate for a continuing resolution that would fund the government until about 6 weeks after the election, but before Christmas break. And then they would pass an omnibus or a minibus that would keep their spending going and the programs in place, even once Trump is once again publicly recognized as president. He's going to use the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 to slash the spending on Green New Deal projects and the WHO and all sorts of other ridiculous and wasteful spending. And because the Uniparty knows that's coming, they're going to try to get this deal done to lock all that spending in place. And if we can understand each and every one of those issues and how they work together, then we can glide right on past that narrative, unless that's really our thing. If you want to learn all about those issues, by all means, learn all about them. But otherwise, the point of all those stories is to learn about all those issues so you can understand the dynamic that I just presented. It's not so that you can freak out for the next 2 months about Venezuelan migrants. The global slave trade is part of the global regime's agenda. It's not part of Donald Trump's agenda. Shutting that down presents major problems for the global criminal enterprise. It isn't a mystery why they don't like Donald Trump. They don't like his supporters. They don't like nationalism, and they don't like the multipolar world order that's emerging. And we'll get right back to all that in just a second. But we also had to hear for 3 or 4 days about Donald Trump's trip to the Arlington cemetery last week. He was invited there by the families, but the members of the Uniparty, who understand that it looks bad that Donald Trump is presenting himself as the president and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are nowhere to be found on the 3rd anniversary of that disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal event, know that they're getting destroyed on the optics, so they want to make what Donald Trump did a bad thing. They're going to claim that it's illegal and that he was using the Arlington visit for political purposes, which is not allowed. Oh, they were going to bring the rule book down on Donald Trump for getting optics they just can't get. But the thing is, it was the families of the 13 soldiers who were killed who invited Donald Trump to that event and asked him to come, and were thankful that he was there, and they were happy to have the pictures of that day with the president. Somehow all of that is still being talked about today. I guess the media feels that they need somehow to discredit that whole thing, because regardless of whether it was a political event, and it wasn't, it still is a political event when it's reported on. And as far as the political event is concerned, that's a major loss for the Trump haters. This is essentially the suckers and losers hoax reprise from 2020. The regime has all its biggest influencers and propagandists out there saying that Donald Trump somehow disrespected the military by attending this event. And they think that even in comparison to the fake president Joe Biden and the fake vice president Kamala Harris and the fake vice president's fake vice president Tim Walz, ignoring the thing completely. But we've learned those lessons too, haven't we? Some people at least understand the story pattern, but they still get invested emotionally. They still worry what the result is going to be. The result's going to be the same it was last time. 2020 was a far more fraught and emotional situation than what we're dealing with now. That was the very deadly pandemic and the summer of love. People were losing their minds, and there were a whole lot more Trump haters back then. There aren't that many Trump haters now. And the Trump haters there are look progressively more insane by the day. And everyone who's not a Trump hater realizes that more every day. These stories are instant backfires at this point. The Trump haters look petty. Their true motivations have already been exposed. Get Trump at any cost, and a lot of people are sick of it now. CNN's Natasha Bertrand, formerly of Politico, you might remember her for being the author of the article about the 51 former intelligence officials claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop had all the hallmarks or earmarks, or whatever they said, of Russian disinformation. She was also a major Russia hoaxer. She tried to go after John Ratcliffe for reporting to the country about Iran's interference in the 2020 election. And she's basically just been a mouthpiece for the deep state's corrupt intelligence community. The headline of her article in CNN today, John McCain's son decries Trump appearance at Arlington as violation that turned cemetery into campaign backdrop. So apparently they've introduced a new character, John McCain's son, Jimmy McCain. Strange scene, talking about a week-old story that the public has already rejected, but it's not like the public was begging for more McCains. Now, speaking of traitors and the fake administration, Joe Biden was back from 3 weeks on vacation with his weird speech after midnight on Monday night of the Democrat National Convention, the only real appearance for the fake president. He was on the beach a few times, walking around in shorts a lot, but he didn't spend much time pretending to be president. He was in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, then he went to a beach in California, and then he went back to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. Most people don't even bother pretending he's president anymore. John Kirby gets questions about who's running the country. People think something changed 45 days ago, but no, it's been like this the whole time. So Joe and Kamala were in Pittsburgh yesterday to tell the labor unions how very, very important they are to stealing elections and having successful astroturfed protest movements out in the streets of major cities around the country. And Kamala Harris decided to show off her multifaceted personality. And I'm not talking about how she's black and Indian and I guess sort of Jewish and I guess even maybe sort of white. You'll see what I mean.
You better thank a union member for the 5-day work week. You better thank a union member for sick leave. You better thank a union member for paid leave. You better thank a union member for vacation time. Thank unions for sick leave. Thank unions for paid family leave. Thank unions for your vacation time.
It's funny, this whole vibes-based campaign, this whole joy-based campaign, this whole campaign to let Americans know who Kamala Harris is. It doesn't seem like Kamala Harris knows who Kamala Harris is. Kamala Harris, that retarded lady who just reads what's in the teleprompter. And as I said, the fake president was right by her side. He gave a speech in Pittsburgh yesterday, and there was a moment during that speech where he just had that weird blank stare, like someone shut Joe Biden off for about 5 or 10 seconds, and then Joe extends his right hand off to the side and maybe a little bit behind him, reaching back for Kamala. And she takes Joe's hand, looking like maybe she's a little worried. Maybe he's having a really late stage senior moment. Who knows if maybe Joe Biden has actually almost shut down on stage. And so she grabs his hand to check on him, and then Joe just won't let go. He starts talking and goes for about 90 seconds. And throughout that time, he's figured out a way to wrap his arm around Kamala, that little tiny woman, barely making it above the table at WeWork, where CNN filmed their very important interview, to which she brought a chaperone last week, just legs under the table, kicking on her chair like a 5-year-old. Kamala Harris, in her first big girl interview, being asked what she thought about a photograph of her and her niece. But anyway, Joe wraps his arm around Kamala, so small and so young, just how he likes him. And he holds on to her for that whole 90 seconds as she looks continuously more uncomfortable. She pats him on the back a few times to say, "Hey, Joe, that's enough." And she tries to just move away slightly. Just her lean is out a little bit away from Joe Biden, but he doesn't let go. He brings her on in. Gives her a kiss on the forehead. I'm surprised he didn't say, "You kind of think of me as your father, don't you?" And Kamala was probably thinking, "I'll just pretend to be Indian now, so the black side of me doesn't feel totally disgraced as I hug this perverted old Klansman in pursuit of more power." Let's check in on our boy Blue quickly, just for nostalgia's sake.
No longer be the manufacturing capital of the world. Where the hell is that written? We are the greatest manufacturing city, county in the world, state in the world, in the world. We're going to remain that way.
I mean, that clip had it all. That was a Joe Biden trifecta. Lying, mumbling, screaming incoherently. Classic Biden. He returned last night to the set of the White House and filmed this brief scene outside.
President, how was it to be back on the campaign trail today?
Feels good.
Good? How do you feel about Pennsylvania?
Except I'm not able to go out in the crowds anymore. The Secret Service doesn't let me.
No, why not?
Well, because it says too dangerous. No one gets to go out. No, we're not. You know, serious.
How do you feel about Pennsylvania right now?
I feel real good about Pennsylvania. I think we're going to win Pennsylvania.
So the woman asked the fake president how it feels to be back out on the campaign trail. He said it feels good, but he's not allowed to go out in the crowds anymore. The Secret Service doesn't let me, he said. The question was asked, why not? And he said, they say it's too dangerous. No one gets to go out. No one gets to go out. You're the president. Donald Trump goes out. And wait a second, you were just on the beach for days at a time. Maybe I just don't understand how safe the beaches of Delaware are. I mean, I guess it's probably a private beach. And then again, to be fair, no trip out is really safe for Joe Biden. The guy falls off things and falls over all the time. Perhaps this will be the excuse they use to explain why Kamala's massive concert rallies and the huge DNC, all that vibes-based stuff, have been replaced by 200-person events in high school gyms. It's kind of like their COVID circles and their car rallies in 2020. Eventually, you just go back to the basement and stop having events because the events show how unpopular you are. And you have to have a justification for that. In 2020, it was the most deadly pandemic of all time. And now it's because there might be a pandemic of presidential assassination attempts. They had one on the other guy, which is kind of the fake president's fault, or it would be if he was a real president. And so I guess at that point, the only responsible thing to do is shut the whole thing down and focus on vibes. All right, so let's break out of the normie sphere and get to some more interesting stories. And we'll start with Venezuela, though not the Venezuelan migrants in Colorado. And by the way, if you look up Venezuelan migrants in Colorado, they didn't just get there. You can find articles from last year in places like NPR talking about how Colorado's mountain towns had all sorts of work available for Venezuelan migrants. Mountain towns, where rich internationalists hire foreign workers rather than American workers. And why? Because American workers who might take jobs like that at this point have in many small communities fallen victim to the influx of the pharmaceutical versions of street drugs and are being devastated. Thank goodness all of these illegal aliens are coming in so that we have a great replacement option. I'm kidding, of course, that's just a theory. We were told a few weeks back that Nicolas Maduro had stolen his election. The brutal authoritarian socialist who was then promoted to communist dictator refused to relinquish power just because the Venezuelan people didn't want him to. And that was unacceptable for the global regime. A few weeks ago, we went over that 2020 report from the International Crisis Group, on whose board of trustees sit Mark Malek Brown, George Soros, and Alexander Soros, funded by major transnational banks and energy companies. The report was essentially on the status of negotiations and leverage for how the global regime might be able to finally successfully remove Nicolas Maduro from power. They've been going after this for 6 years, and he just thwarted them a few weeks ago. That was the source of all the international attention, including from Elon Musk, the owner of X, formerly Twitter, who called Maduro a donkey and took away his special silver verification badge on X, formerly Twitter, and threatened him with space lasers and told him he was going to send him to Mars. Very dangerous, very scary, very serious geopolitical concern. Major American technology industrialist and Defense Department contractor threatens leader of resource-rich foreign nation with space lasers and trips to Mars. Let the meltdown commence. This sounds like the start of World War III. And then normie right-wing influencers began spreading videos of Venezuela's BLM Antifa running around the streets, rioting, setting things on fire, and generally causing mayhem. And that lasted for about 2 days. Because, of course, the influencers were on to other things, but so were the protesters and rioters. It's like it was all just a show. This article is from yesterday in the Associated Press. Venezuelan judge issues arrest warrant for opposition's former presidential candidate. A Venezuelan judge on Monday issued an arrest warrant for the opposition's former presidential candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, as part of a criminal investigation into the results of the highly anticipated July election that both the ruling party and its opponents claim to have won. Now, it's interesting that they call him Edmundo Gonzalez because his name is Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia. And of course, there's also Maria Corina Machado, who was being smuggled in on the back of Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia. Edmundo was the Joe Biden, Maria Corina Machado, the Kamala Harris. She wasn't able to run, so they just ran this old guy that no one knew instead, hoping that everyone would vote for him and get her. But let's continue. The warrant was issued at the request of authorities who accuse Gonzalez, a former diplomat, of various crimes, including conspiracy, falsifying documents, and usurpation of powers. The move is the latest escalation of repression against the opposition. In the month after election officials declared President Nicolas Maduro had won a third 6-year term in office. Authorities sought the warrant after Gonzalez failed to appear 3 times to answer questions from prosecutors. Gonzalez, 75, has not made any public appearances since the day after the election. His campaign did not immediately respond to a request for comment from the Associated Press. Now, I seem to remember all of the regime's propaganda media outlets and a mass of people across social media declaring loudly that this authoritarian socialist communist brutal dictator had definitely stolen the election and that the regime's favorite candidate and the man she was Trojan horsing in with had all the receipts. Why have they disappeared and avoided the media? Is it because the Maduro regime would be just too brutal to them? I mean, it doesn't sound like they've really staved that off, right? If they were the legitimate winners, they should have been out there on the airwaves talking to whoever they could, making their case to the people, rallying their supporters to show the strength of their masses in a peaceful fashion. Like Donald Trump did. But instead, they've hidden themselves away and refused to cooperate with the authorities. And I know, it's okay that they don't, because Maduro is a brutal authoritarian socialist promoted to communist dictator who rules Venezuela with an iron fist. It didn't stop them from pretending that they won the election and claiming that Maduro stole it, and then launching their army of color revolutionist foot soldiers out onto the streets. But meeting with lawyers, talking to the media, far too dangerous, especially for people who won 80% of the vote. Maduro stole the election, right? He's a brutal authoritarian socialist now promoted to communist dictator. Those guys steal elections. If there's one thing we know, it's that whenever the regime's media calls someone a strongman or an authoritarian or a brutal dictator or whatever, that guy steals elections. Just like whenever some politicians talk constantly about democracy but won't let anyone check to make sure the votes are counted properly, that's because they are extremely popular, in fact, beloved figures, and the true champions of a civilized democratic society under the rule of law. Prosecutors have zeroed in on thousands of tally sheets known as actas, printouts measuring several feet that resemble shopping receipts that have long been considered the ultimate proof of election results in Venezuela. Each of the 30,000 electronic voting machines used in the July 28th election printed several copies of the sheets, whose information was also transmitted to the National Electoral Council. So you see, they've got these pieces of paper that the machines print out, and those are the ultimate proof of how people voted. Machine paper says we win. Very safe, very secure. The ultimate proof. According to the Associated Press, if the machine prints this paper this way, it is indisputable. Consider what you're being told in the late summer of 2024. Think about how far back you would have to be on an informational timeline to read that and think, if they have the receipts, that's all there is to it. You just can't argue with what voting machines print out. It's important to remember, by the way, that Smartmatic started down in Venezuela. Venezuela is basically the birthplace of voting machine-based election fraud. Ruling party-loyal electoral authorities declared Maduro the victor hours after polls closed, but they did not publish results broken down by voting machine as they had done in previous presidential elections. The National Electoral Council claimed it could not release the detailed information because its website was hacked. Sounds to me like the regime is extremely upset that the way they planned on cheating and then proving to the world that they won was taken out of their control. Darn, shucks, I feel real bad for them. You have to love how they describe the election officials as loyal to the ruling party, while they made clear in that International Crisis Group report that one of the goals of the regime was to change the balance of the National Electoral Council so that it would favor them. They were trying to rig the system they now call rigged. But let's leave that point aside for a second, because I'm sure some of you don't find that convincing. You think, well, if they were trying to change the board, that's because Maduro had what they considered a 4-1 advantage on that board. So that might be considered ruling party loyal. First, it's ruling party loyal from their perspective. That is not necessarily an objective claim. That is just their claim. We could imagine a board of that kind in the United States understanding our uniparty. We could imagine having one MAGA member, one Democrat, and 3 uniparty Republicans. The regime, for its purposes, would call that a 4-1 Republican majority. But in real terms, that is a 4-1 uniparty majority over MAGA. So their description is worthless. But even if they were accurately describing it, think about what things will look like after this period of chaos subsides and the uniparty is removed. Patriotic Americans who assume the role of public officials all across the country are not going to be swayed by arguments that they need to allow the uniparty to participate too. We should expect our public officials in the future to recognize the influence of the global regime and then reject it in all cases. We should be embracing a future of no political parties whatsoever. Will we and should we care when regime propaganda media tries to claim that we are being loyal to our own cause and being unfair to them? They don't have rights to participate in our election process. The entire notion is preposterous. Foreign interference in American elections was the entire purpose of Executive Order 13848 under the Trump administration. If you're not familiar with that, I suggest that you should be. But if we don't want foreign interference in our elections, and that means from global governing organizations, globalist NGOs, etc., why would Venezuela want that? Back to the article. By law, each party participating in the election has the right to a tally sheet from every machine. Government supporters attempted to block opposition representatives from obtaining copies of the crucial documents, but it managed to secure them from more than 80% of machines. And we are supposed to believe that those are all authentic documents that represent the real and true results of the election. This is their evidence that Maduro stole that election. I wonder if Maduro has evidence that he didn't. Not that that's really relevant in this scenario. Gonzalez and opposition leader Maria Corina Machado then stunned supporters and adversaries alike by announcing the documents showed Maduro lost by a wide margin against the former diplomat and publishing the records online. As international pressure grew to release a breakdown of results, Maduro asked the country's high court to audit the electoral process, drawing immediate criticism from foreign observers who said the court is too close to the government to produce an independent review. Man, that's unfortunate. From the global regime's perspective, they can't get a fair shake in Venezuela. Darn, they almost had it. But nope, turns out they don't have any right to interfere in Venezuela's elections. I'm very sad to hear, though, that the court is so biased when the regime candidates lose, especially because the argument for the Trump haters that Joe Biden actually received 81 million real lawful American votes is because Donald Trump lost all 62 of his court cases. Now, that's not true, but even if it was true, it wouldn't have any bearing on the underlying truth of what the election results were. But the regime, they didn't listen to any claims of judicial bias back then. In fact, they were furious that the courts would look at any of those cases because they were just obviously wrong because the regime said so. The magistrates of the Supreme Tribunal of Justice are proposed by federal officials and ratified by the National Assembly, which is dominated by Maduro sympathizers. Yeah, you see, they're sympathizers. They're not members of his party. He doesn't have a vast majority because the Venezuelan people prefer him to the global regime. They're just sympathizers who he's bought off, or maybe even promised certain perks to. It's probably totally corrupt. Like the American Uniparty. It's just inversion after inversion after inversion. The court concluded on August 22nd that vote counts published by the opposition were false and certified Maduro's victory. Maduro's United Socialist Party of Venezuela refused to publish its copies of tally sheets. Gonzalez, who represented the unitary platform Opposition Coalition, was summoned to the prosecutor's office as recently as Friday. He has questioned the prosecutor's actions for lack of due process guarantees and accused Attorney General Tarek William Saab, a longtime Maduro ally, of being a political accuser who, quote, condemns in advance. Gonzalez rejected the interview summons, arguing, among other issues, that they did not specify the condition under which he was expected to appear. Maduro has lost all touch with reality, Machado wrote on X after the warrant was issued. The arrest warrant issued by the regime to threaten President-elect Edmundo Gonzalez crosses a new line that only strengthens the resolve of our movement. Venezuelans and democracies around the world are more united than ever in our quest for freedom. Remember how many times they called Joe Biden the president-elect and had him in the office of the president-elect? It's weird, isn't it? Especially looking back now, knowing that there's no way in hell Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes, and virtually everyone else understands it now, too. They branded him as hard as they could as the president-elect, while calling anyone who questioned it a purveyor of the big lie. But all of this is different because Maduro is a very, very, very bad guy. An AP review of the tally sheets released by the opposition indicates that Gonzalez won significantly more votes than the government has claimed. The analysis casts serious doubt on the official declaration that Maduro won. Really? Why doesn't it cast doubt on the machines? The AP processed almost 24,000 images, representing the results from 79% of voting machines, resulting in tabulations of 10.26 million votes. The processed tally sheets also showed Gonzalez receiving more votes on 20,476 receipts compared to only 3,157 for Maduro. The lack of transparency over the results, coupled with the widespread arrests that followed anti-government protests in the days after the election, has drawn global condemnation against Maduro and his allies. Among those who have been detained are Machado's lawyer, opposition leaders, journalists, political organizers, and poll workers. So everybody involved in stealing elections. In the United States, those same descriptors would be, basically, Mark Elias, leading uniparty figures who have made careers out of stealing elections, like virtually everyone in the Congress and Senate. I would suspect you couldn't go far enough. And then you have to bring it down to the state and local level. If local election officials are committing election fraud, most particularly while the country is in a state of emergency or war, you have to hold them accountable, don't you? They're committing treason. And political organizers, should BLM Antifa organizers have been held accountable after the Summer of Love in 2020? I would argue that, yes, they should have been. And hopefully that's happening. And journalists? Yeah, journalists are part of the election interference on behalf of those global entities. So, sorry, traitors, them's the breaks. Are we supposed to feel bad about people like that being prosecuted in Venezuela for making themselves allies of the global regime and trying to overthrow their own country? Because of the way we hear these stories, through the biased lens of the global regime's media, we give them the benefit of the doubt, like all of this just happened by accident, like politicians don't know they stole their seats, like the lawyers don't know they're defending election fraud, like the BLM activists actually think they're saving black lives, or like election officials don't realize that they're helping to steal elections. They know. They've been convinced it's heroic, which is why they'll participate in crimes against the country for a very small amount of money. The article ends by noting that the Chilean government on Monday decried the arrest warrant for Gonzalez and reiterated its, quote, condemnation of any form of repression against opponents of the dictatorial regime in Venezuela, end quote. The Chilean government, the foreign ministry said in a statement, calls for respect for democratic principles as well as human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Venezuelans. Man, how bad are things going for the regime down in South America that the strongest statement they can get on their side is from Chile? Where is Luis Inácio Lula da Silva? In Brazil, the Brazilian Joe Biden. He must hold some major sway. He mildly suggested a few weeks ago that maybe Maduro should hold new elections before the end of his term, which is 6 months away. They had an early election just to stage this show for everyone, so we could have all these opportunities for learning about the elections and the dynamics in the regime messaging before we have our own fake election in November. Or not. It's okay. I'm sure we'll have one sometime. Or we won't. Or we won't. Because Trump already won in 2020. We don't need to have another election. Why would we have another fake election? Oh, right. It's because everybody wants to get the hose again. So that's the state of play in regard to Venezuela's elections. But what about Maduro? Is he just going to get away with it? Saying he won the fake election when it was the regime's turn to say that they won the fake election? He's just going to stay in power even though the regime's media outlets told everybody he's very bad? We can't let him get away with it. Well, then, thank goodness, CNN's Jim Acosta has, I guess, reappeared from his sabbatical or something. What happened to Jim Acosta? He was there every day annoying Trump, one of the most annoying television characters there was, and now he's just left our lives. And it's okay if we feel emptier and like things just don't have the meaning they used to. Let's just be happy he's returned.
Some exclusive live pictures that we're showing you right now of the seized plane belonging to Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. Maduro, we should note, is not on board, but the plane was seized by officials for violating U.S. sanctions. CNN's Kylie Atwood joins me now. Kylie, this is pretty extraordinary. This does not happen, obviously, every day where U.S. authorities go in and seize the plane of a head of state. But that is essentially what's happened this morning. Can you break this down for us?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the plane of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, is now in the hands of the United States.
That's right. To retaliate, they stole his plane. Seized his plane. From the Dominican Republic. Isn't that strange? The United States can just steal the planes of foreign leaders from third-party countries? How does that happen? Also, how does Nicolas Maduro have such a small plane? Fox News published this article yesterday. U.S. seizes Venezuelan leader Maduro's plane in the Dominican Republic. Now, we're not going to go through all of this, but a little bit. The United States seized a plane owned by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in the Dominican Republic, Fox News has confirmed. Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, flew Maduro's personal plane back to the United States Monday morning when it landed in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and is now in U.S. custody, a U.S. official told Fox News following an initial report by CNN. The plane, described by officials as Maduro's version of Air Force One, is used for Maduro's state visits around the world and was seized in the Dominican Republic after it was purchased through a straw company in violation of sanction laws and export controls, the official said. U.S. authorities cited a specific violation of U.S. Executive Order 13884, signed by former President Donald Trump in 2019. So Trump Executive Order 13884 blocked all property and interests in property of the government of Venezuela within the U.S. jurisdiction. By cutting Venezuela off from the U.S. financial system, it prevented U.S. individuals and entities from doing business, making financial transactions with the government of Venezuela. I mentioned Executive Order 13848 earlier. That allows similar sanctions and seizures of assets for entities and individuals involved with foreign interference in American elections. That's 13848. This is 13884. An executive order released on August 5th, 2019, just 1 week under 5 years before the Venezuelan election in question. Homeland Security Investigations, by the way, is apparently a federal police force under the Department of Homeland Security that, to be honest, I've never heard of before. Apparently, they were started in 2010. They have offices in 235 cities across the United States and 90 offices in more than 50 foreign countries. On whose behalf are they working? My friend Patrick Gunnels, in our episode of Hindsight 2020 last night on Badlands Media, made the point that the Department of Homeland Security started under the Bush administration ostensibly in response to 9/11 seems to be understandable as a special toolkit of the regime within the United States government. They don't actually secure the homeland. They violate the rights of the American people. So for whatever reason, they were sent down to the Dominican Republic to snatch Nicolas Maduro's plane and fly it back to Florida. From the Fox News article, let this seizure send a clear message. Aircraft illegally acquired from the United States for the benefit of sanctioned Venezuelan officials cannot just fly off into the sunset. Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement Matthew Axelrod of the Department of Commerce added, "It doesn't matter how fancy the private jet or how powerful the officials, we will work relentlessly with our partners here and across the globe to identify and return any aircraft illegally smuggled outside of the United States." The article notes that the plane is worth about $13 million. It is a Dassault Falcon 900EX. the illegitimate attorney general of the illegitimate occupying government, says that Maduro illegally purchased the plane through a shell company and smuggled it out of the United States. In late 2022 and early 2023, persons affiliated with Maduro allegedly used a Caribbean-based shell company to conceal their involvement in the illegal purchase. Federal investigators say the aircraft was then illegally exported from the U.S. to Venezuela through the Caribbean in April 2023. Since May 2023, the plane, and Fox for whatever reason notes the tail number T7ESPRT, quote, has flown almost exclusively to and from a military base in Venezuela and has been used for the benefit of Maduro and his representatives, including to transport Maduro on visits to other countries. This according to the DOJ. I would want to know, to and from that military base to where? To Caracas? What was it doing in the Dominican Republic? Trump posted about all this on Truth Social this morning. He wrote, Maduro's plane has just been seasoned by the U.S. That's okay. He can now go out and get a much bigger and better one with all the money we pay to Venezuela for oil that we don't need. We have more liquid gold than any other nation. How stupid are our quote-unquote leaders? We are a laughingstock all over the world, DJT. Not long after posting, Trump deleted that post and reposted with the word seized spelled correctly and without the N. Does it mean something? Maybe. Do we know what it means? Nope. Now, there were some pictures posted of the HSI agents walking down the steps of the plane carrying big cardboard boxes with the word evidence printed across the side in huge letters. So what's in those boxes? Well, it's got to be evidence. Evidence of what? Who knows? Is it evidence that Nicolas Maduro actually stole the Venezuela election? Was Nicolas Maduro just having his plane sent around the world without him on it, with boxes of evidence of him stealing the election? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Who knows? Maybe Nicolas Maduro is stashed away in that plane somewhere and Homeland Security Investigations hasn't found him. Maybe he'll escape in the dead of night and wind up at Mar-a-Lago in a few days. Or maybe those massive boxes of evidence have all the goods on all of the other elections that have been stolen by voting machines downstream in one way or another from that Venezuelan company, Smartmatic. Maybe Nicolas Maduro knows where Joe Biden's additional 30+ million votes came from. It would honestly be hilarious if the regime's election fraud apparatus worldwide was taken down by Nicolas Maduro, and that all the proof was on Nicolas Maduro's plane that was seized by DHS under a Trump executive order written nearly 5 years to the day before the Venezuelan election in question. All right, so let's keep moving in this brutal dictator extravaganza. Now we go to Russia, where brutal dictator Vladimir Putin has decided to take himself a trip to Mongolia. This is the New York Times from today. Putin gets a red carpet welcome in Mongolia despite arrest warrant. Politico's article on the subject, by the way, the headline, "Sorry Not Sorry," says Mongolia after failure to arrest Putin. But we will stick with the New York Times. President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia was warmly received by the leader of Mongolia on Tuesday in his first state visit to a member nation of the International Criminal Court since it issued a warrant for his arrest last year. Instead of arresting Mr. Putin, as the ICC, Ukraine, and human rights groups have urged, Mongolia, which is highly dependent on Russia for its energy needs, gave the Russian leader a red carpet welcome in the capital, Ulaanbaatar. Mr. Putin was greeted by an honor guard, some on horseback, whose uniforms were inspired by the 13th century Mongol ruler Genghis Khan. Following the ceremonial welcome, Mr. Putin and President Ukna Kurelsuk of Mongolia held talks in a traditional yurt in Ulaanbaatar's state palace. Skipping ahead, Mongolia, which relies on Russia for 95% of its petroleum products, has refrained from condemning Russia's war in Ukraine and has abstained during United Nations votes concerning the conflict. Mongolia is one of the top destinations for Russians fleeing the country in 2022 after the war began, and the Kremlin announced a mobilization campaign. Now, Russians in Russia have not been under any danger the entire time, but we are to believe that Putin's very brutal invasion did not have the support of the Russian people, and many of them left rather than getting conscripted into Putin's military to help him with this very brutal invasion. And all of those brave Russians left to Mongolia. Officials in Ukraine, which has been under intense missile and drone attacks in the past week and a half, expressed outrage over Mr. Putin's visit. The Mongolian government's failure to carry out the binding ICC arrest warrant for Putin is a heavy blow to the International Criminal Court and the international criminal justice system, said a foreign ministry spokesman of Ukraine on X, formerly Twitter. Mongolia has allowed an accused criminal to evade justice, thereby sharing responsibility for the war crimes. We will work with partners to ensure that this has consequences for Ulaanbaatar. And I'm sure they are very, very scared of the might of the International Criminal Court. Skipping ahead in the article. Russia, like the United States, does not recognize the jurisdiction of the court, which is based in The Hague in the Netherlands. However, Mongolia is one of 124 signatories of the Rome Statute, which governs membership in the International Court. Mr. Putin's visit is being portrayed at home as a sign that Western efforts to turn him into a global pariah since he launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 have not been effective. They note that Putin brought a large delegation with him, including high-level Russian officials and also executives from several large companies, including energy companies, and they signed various energy deals. Since a rubber stamp election in March, Mr. Putin has made 7 foreign trips, including to China, North Korea, Vietnam, Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan. In all of 2023, Mr. Putin made 6 foreign trips, including to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. He declined to travel to South Africa for a summit of the BRICS group of countries last year because South Africa is also part of the ICC. And yes, I'm sure he was trembling. The Financial Times covered Putin's visit. The headline in their article, Putin visits Mongolia despite international arrest warrant. They note, Russian flags were displayed in the Mongolian capital, and soldiers in brightly colored uniforms lined a red carpet laid out to welcome Putin at the airport. We are not worried. We have an excellent dialogue with our Mongolian friends, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters. Further on in the article, they include some reaction from various foreign officials. Mikhailo Podolyak, advisor to Ukraine's presidential administration, said ignoring the warrant would show the world, quote, there are no rules. Mongolia has to detain him, Podolyak told Ukrainian television news on Friday. Will it do so? Most likely not. That's why Putin's visit is happening, to show that there are no rules, no ICC, and no Rome Statute. That's right. There's none of that. It's totally irrelevant. The global governing bodies just cease to exist when the powerful countries no longer care. And this is true for any governing body or any body of rules. If the people to whom the rules are applied are stronger or greater in number than the people applying or enforcing the rules, then there are no rules the minute whatever people or entities the rules are supposed to apply to stop complying. Putin and the Russians don't care. The Mongolians don't care. Therefore, the rules are useless. And if the rules can be ignored at any time, then the body is useless. Maria Elena Vignoli, who is apparently a senior international justice counsel at Human Rights Watch, said in a statement, welcoming Putin, an ICC fugitive, would not only be an affront to the many victims of Russian forces' crimes, but would also undermine the crucial principle that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. So first off, that is a rather highfalutin title for someone at the Human Rights Watch. They're not the Justice League. These aren't superheroes. It's just a global governance cutout that does the bidding of the regime in order to make the bad guys sound really, really bad. Literally everyone in Russia and everyone in the United States and everyone in all of the other countries who haven't signed on to that agreement are already above that law. That law literally doesn't apply to any of those people. But the truth is that everybody else is above that law too, because those laws are irrelevant. The body is fake and illegitimate. And if people don't comply, the body may as well immediately cease to exist. The Financial Times article concludes with a little more about the energy deal. Putin's visit to Mongolia comes amid uncertainty over the fate of Power of Siberia 2, a pipeline that, if built, would deliver 50 billion cubic meters of Russian gas across the country to China. The Mongolian government did not mention Power of Siberia 2 or any other new gas pipelines with Russia in its latest 5-year development plan submitted to the parliament last month. In comments to a Mongolian newspaper ahead of his trip, Putin described the country as a close neighbor and old friend. He mentioned Power of Siberia 2 as one of several shared projects, but described it as still at the design and survey stage. So a potential gas pipeline across Mongolia to China, a veritable nightmare for the global regime. Let's go briefly to Zero Hedge. From today, Putin declares Kursk gambit failed as Ukraine's army steamrolled in the east. So Putin gave some remarks in front of a group of students before traveling to Mongolia. Putin, in the fresh remarks, focused on progress in the Donbass, stating the Russian armed forces are taking control of territories not by 200, 300 meters at a time, but by square kilometers. He emphasized this is a rapid pace not seen in a long time. The Kremlin pointed out that the Kursk incursion is happening more out of desperation than anything strategically impacting the battle space. That is, if it is indeed happening. Putin said that Kyiv is inevitably doomed to failure in its cross-border attacks and that Russian forces will, quote, deal with the Ukrainian bandits, end quote, who have breached the border in efforts to destabilize Russia's security. Putin also set out his view that once Kursk fails for Ukraine and as its forces are getting beaten back in Donbass at a rapid pace, Kyiv will soon realize it must negotiate, something Putin said Moscow has never refused to do. But he noted that Zelensky has declared martial law and refused to hold an election. He said the current authorities are clearly not ready for this. They have little chance of being reelected. That is why they are not interested in ending the fighting. That is why they tried to carry out this provocation in Kursk and before when they tried to carry out the same operation in Belgorod. He stressed that regardless, Russia will continue to protect its people in Donbass as, quote, our common future, the future of Russia, end quote. He explained that Russia, quote, cannot allow hostile structures to be created right next to us that hatch aggressive plans against our country and constantly try to destabilize the Russian Federation. And that sounds like he very clearly wants to denazify Ukraine, getting the global regime right out of there. Now, we always have to remember that so much of what we have seen and what we've been told over the last 2.5 years about Putin's very brutal invasion of Ukraine has turned out to be complete and total nonsense. It is to the point where every aspect of that story must be held in the most extreme doubt, to the point where it is legitimate to wonder whether or not any of it is happening. The Ukraine regime waged an ethnic civil war against the Russian-speaking Slavic population of what was called Eastern Ukraine since 2014. This conflict has been going on for a very long time. Events we have been told about over the last 2.5 years could just as easily have happened 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. The argument isn't that nothing has happened. It's not even that nothing is happening now. It's just that we are being presented with stories that quite often have virtually no discernible contact with any reality we can verify, and they are being released on timelines for maximum narrative effect. It makes more sense in that instance to analyze it as narrative only. These situations are being drawn out to expose the global regime. Trump knows that he can end these issues on day one. Why is that? Is it because he's so powerful and these countries will just immediately listen to him? All the people hating one another and battling one another are simply going to stop because Donald Trump says so? Well, I guess that's possible. It's also possible that Trump coming back will just end the fake narratives. Ukraine has not advanced at all in 2.5 years. Russia has done whatever it's wanted. And of course, they had all the Five Eyes intelligence the whole time. We were told Ukraine was going to make its amazing comeback with 2023's spring counteroffensive. Then it was a spring-summer counteroffensive, then a summer counteroffensive. But that never happened because all of their plans got leaked on Discord by a 21-year-old National Guardsman. Are we really supposed to believe they captured some big area in Russia and are threatening a nuclear power plant? Just like the Zaporozhye stories we've heard every 3 months for the last 2.5 years, while nothing has happened, they want a nuclear threat. They want a nuclear disaster that they believe will justify something, but they can't get it. But they also can't end the conflict because they don't seem to have any control whatsoever over the comedic actor in Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. And so the story just continues along with no momentum. It just bleeds out. The illegitimate Biden-Harris administration can't do anything to stop it. They have never been in control of the situation, not for a single second. And so the story continues on. We keep hearing how Ukraine has a chance just to keep it going, to keep people engaged, as the regime looks worse and worse and worse. The incursion into Kursk is being used as a narrative device. And the same holds true of the Israeli hostages said to be held by Hamas. We've heard about these hostages for 11 months now. These hostages are meant to be the leverage that would allow the international community to put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu and force a ceasefire agreement. That's what Joe and Kamala have been talking about for weeks. They haven't gotten it done, and I would bet they're not going to get it done. Benjamin Netanyahu certainly doesn't seem like he has any incentive to help them out. And we remember Netanyahu's meeting at Mar-a-Lago just about 5 weeks ago, where they legitimately took a picture showing that Trump has the upper hand. Now, I mentioned the hostages being used as a narrative device, and therefore the need for us to analyze the situation, understanding the hostages as a narrative device. Now, that might sound cold, but the truth is we don't actually know there are any hostages. Now, that would be true as a product of proper epistemology, but I don't have to rely just on that. Back at the end of April, Donald Trump said there weren't any hostages, or at least fewer than were being reported. He's mentioned it before at rallies and in a post on Truth Social. On May 1st, he said Israel will find, very sadly, that there are far fewer hostages than currently being thought. That's why it's hard for Hamas to make a deal. They are no longer able to produce the people because many of them are gone. Hamas is incapable of holding Jewish people for a long period of time without killing them, and it will only get worse. Zero leadership from Biden. October 7th would have never happened if I were president. Not even a small chance, DJT. Now, people always pretend that Donald Trump is just using euphemisms or must not know what he's talking about, but he told us over 3 months ago that the hostages were gone. And he explained that the ceasefire deal wouldn't get done for that reason. It's awfully hard to make a deal for hostages when there aren't hostages. The narrative device would be good for leverage unless it is exposed as a narrative device, and then the leverage is gone. Trump suggests that Hamas would have killed all the hostages, but it's also entirely possible that there simply were not hostages. You can actually just dig into it and see the coordinated social media campaigns, totally astroturfed, not organic at all, to make the hostage crisis a major issue. along the lines of Michelle Obama's Bring Our Girls Home campaign, or the viral hashtag Coney 2012 campaign. It's PR and narrative storytelling meant to create leverage. But the regime has no leverage. The fake administration has no leverage. Kamala can scream all she wants in her weird rallies about how they're going to get a ceasefire deal done, but it doesn't seem like they are going to get a ceasefire deal done. They're not allowed to directly go after Netanyahu, but the media is, and in the past, that always would have worked. But Netanyahu doesn't seem to care, or perhaps there's nothing he can do about it. And then we have to return to a principle I've mentioned many times. If a traumatic or devastating event occurs and immediately the regime or the uniparty seizes on that event and uses it to justify furthering an agenda they were already pursuing, then you should understand immediately that they are not taking the reality of the event seriously. And at that point, if you don't consider that the event in some way or many ways or always is fake, you're kind of missing the point. The regime already wanted to get rid of Netanyahu now for over a year and a half. They were launching color revolutions in Israel way before the paragliding go-kart incident. Then the paragliding go-kart incident happened. Paragliding go-karts flew over the safest and most secure border in all of world history, protected by the world's most expert military and the mythical Iron Dome, combined with the world's greatest intelligence agency of all time. And they knew about it, but failed to stop it. That, of course, was framed as Netanyahu's fault. He should have been able to stop it, but he didn't. For 11 months, we have watched Israel simps and other lunatics suggest that the global proxy state of Israel has the right to kill indiscriminately whenever and wherever they choose in response to the paragliding go-kart incident that Israel failed to stop. And to counter that, we've seen the other side of that controlled opposition dynamic talk about how Israel is committing genocide. And I'm not saying Israel has committed no genocide over the years in Palestine. There's an argument to be made that having the Nazis set up your proxy state in Palestinian land was already a genocide. But you're not allowed to talk about that once you name it Israel and pretend that everyone there has roots in the region and not just in Eastern Europe. But the one thing that both sides of the controlled opposition have agreed about for at least the last year and a half is that Benjamin Netanyahu has to go. So we had one color revolution, one paragliding go-kart incident, and now we're getting another color revolution. This is the Financial Times from today. Benjamin Netanyahu doubles down on Gaza's strategy as he seeks to ride out latest storm. When Israel's powerful trade union federation called a general strike last year in an attempt to stop Benjamin Netanyahu's plans for a controversial judicial overhaul, he was forced to delay the project, his first concession in a bitter battle in which he had ignored months of mass protests. Netanyahu, by the way, was attempting to limit the power of the high court in Israel, while the regime was pursuing a strategy of making that court as powerful as possible, like they've done in Brazil. They like to capture parts of government and then make that part of government as powerful as possible, particularly the judiciary, because their titles alone make them sound as though they are pursuing justice, and they are presented as the authority of last resort. They always decide what's fair and good, so why not make them the most powerful? That was the attempt to seize power last year. A color revolution was launched to help achieve that goal, and it didn't work. So Benjamin Netanyahu had to be removed, hence the paragliding go-kart incident. That also didn't work. So now we have another color revolution based on the reported deaths of these hostages, the hostages who Trump said were gone over 3 months ago. Back to the article. But if his opponents hoped history would repeat itself on Monday, they were disappointed. Faced with another strike and huge protests calling for him to do a deal to free the Israeli hostages held by Hamas, even if it meant ending the war with the militant group, Netanyahu doubled down. In a defiant press conference Monday night, the Israeli prime minister insisted that the war would only end, quote, when Hamas no longer rules Gaza, end quote, and repeated his refusal to withdraw troops from the border between Gaza and Egypt, which is widely seen as one of the main obstacles to a deal. So that's called the Philadelphia Corridor. When we have our boot on Hamas's skull, that's when they want us to make concessions, he said of those who oppose his stance. When Hamas understands we're not ending the war, they'll give in. And think of it. All of these Israelis out in the streets opposing Netanyahu, angry that these hostages have died. The paragliding go-kart incident, we were told, was Israel's 9/11, and Israel was extremely justified in killing whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted, in response to that terrible incident, their 9/11. But apparently, just last week, the people of Israel have decided they've had enough. They just want those hostages back now. Even if Hamas committed a 9/11 against Israel with the paragliding go-kart incident, enough is enough, according to the liberal supporters of the global regime who are opposing Netanyahu. War, what is it good for? Well, it's good for a while, and then eventually you just have to demand it stops. We've been told the whole time that we should be supporting Israel in this war and that we should still be supporting Israel in this war. But apparently there are a bunch of people in Israel who don't support the war. And they're not anti-Semitic, are they? I mean, I can't tell. The word Semitic has no meaning anymore. And if Israels or Jews or Semites are disagreeing with one another, which side is anti-Semitic? Are all of them anti-Semitic? Are none of them anti-Semitic? What am I talking about? Of course, the anti-Semites are the people who oppose the global regime agenda. That's really what the definition is. But the world is shown mass protests and told about hundreds of thousands of Israelis out there in the streets making their demands. They are sick of Netanyahu doing whatever it is Netanyahu's doing. He's got to go or else they can't do their things. And thank goodness they've engaged all of the labor unions and had them go on a general strike, or else there wouldn't be anybody out in the streets to protest, just like there wouldn't be anybody at Kamala Harris rallies if it weren't for regime-aligned labor unions, sending their workers down to support the cause. It's not communism. It's just workers expressing their opinions that they have to express because their union says so. But let's keep going. Analysts said part of the reason the latest strike called by the Histadrut Federation did not force Netanyahu's hand was that rather than presenting a united front, it laid bare Israel's deep divisions. See, just anti-Semites versus anti-Semites, apparently. While liberal cities such as Tel Aviv took part, more conservative ones, such as Jerusalem, did not. The strike's impact was further weakened when a court ruled on Monday that it should end early, arguing that it was being called for political ends. So how about that? The anti-Netanyahu protest movement is just a liberal cause. It's just the BLM Antifa of Israel. And of course, Tel Aviv is the San Francisco of Israel, the Kyiv of Israel. And the court says the labor union strike is being done for political ends. It's not about the workers. The workers are being used for their numbers to affect political outcomes. The mass protests that accompanied the strike betrayed similar fissures. Triggered by anger at the killing of 6 hostages held by Hamas, they were the biggest public display of support for a hostage deal so far, bringing hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets. But analysts said their numbers were still largely drawn from the liberal sections of Israeli society that protested against Netanyahu and the judicial overhaul that his right-wing coalition was pushing last year, rather than from within his own camp. Naturally, the regime is framing all of this as Netanyahu and his allies being afraid to lose power. They write, but the 2 ultra-nationalist parties, headed by Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, remain implacably opposed to any deal that ends the war before Hamas's destruction. They have threatened to pull out of the coalition and force early elections, which polls suggest the coalition would lose if Netanyahu yields. So see that? Netanyahu has to continue the genocide, otherwise he's going to get voted out of office by all of those liberal protesters and union workers. And let's jump down to the end here. At the end of October, beginning of November, when the Knesset returns and there are elections in the U.S., things will be more complex for him, said Strockler. And Strockler is Nadav Strockler, a political strategist who previously worked with Netanyahu. That's basically like asking a former Trump official. It's really a grab bag. You don't know what you're going to get. He goes on. So I think he wants to accomplish something big before November. It could be a deal, but not on these conditions, or it could be something in the north. And he's talking about the fight against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Netanyahu has wars on so many fronts. In the meantime, however, few observers expect Netanyahu to change tack. Ending the fighting now would leave him facing a reckoning with the failures of October 7th without being able to retort that he had responded by totally destroying Hamas, said Aviv Bushinsky, a political analyst who was Netanyahu's chief of staff in the early 2000s. Why not ask people around Netanyahu right now? Oh, because they're going to say the thing that Netanyahu says and not the thing that the Financial Times needs their article to say, so they'll just find other people to say those things. While implying that they know what Benjamin Netanyahu is really thinking, they're speaking to his better angels. Same strategy they pursue with Trump in media all the time. He goes on. At the moment, Netanyahu is the one being blamed for the October 7th tragedy and leading a war that did not achieve the ultimate victory he promised. Under these circumstances, Netanyahu, who defines himself as Mr. Security, can't afford it. And so that's what it is. Netanyahu does not care about the hostages. He only cares about a potential election in the future and the fact that he'll be blamed for Israel's 9/11 as well as his failed response. It's quite an elaborate conspiracy theory, isn't it? It doesn't seem like one because it's coming from the Financial Times. This is one of the key mouthpieces of the regime. We are plugged right into the mainframe. So it can't be a conspiracy theory. Everything they say is true. That's how we know we can trust them about the hostages. But not only does their response to this hostage-killing incident have the same motivation that the same people have had for well over a year and a half, they're even using the exact same strategy. Get Israeli communists, regime supporters, and union workers together and perform a collective ritual victimhood in order to reduce Benjamin Netanyahu's reputation to the point where he is forced to leave. So let's head over to CNN from yesterday. Tumultuous weekend for Israelis leaves Netanyahu with fewer options than ever. And I'm just going to hit a few spots in this article. They write, gripped by swelling protests and labor union strikes, the weeks ahead for Israel are unpredictable. These well-tested democratic tools of change have toppled governments before. But it's best to remember that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a political survivor extraordinaire. And let's just read that again. CNN is describing liberal protests done in conjunction with labor union strikes. And they write, these well-tested democratic tools of change have toppled governments before. Honestly, what else needs to be said? That is the purpose right there. That is always the purpose. This isn't an organic movement of the people to remove Netanyahu from power. This is the regime needing Netanyahu removed from power and then funding and organizing the movement to get rid of him. The same color revolution playbook playing out everywhere. Let's skip ahead in the article. And they're referring here to Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. His moves may be calculated to weaken Netanyahu's resolve, and they're having a predictable impact. Unlike Palestinians in Gaza, Israelis can rise up to challenge their leadership. Late-night skirmishes between protesters and the authorities Sunday on Tel Aviv's usually hyper-busy 8-lane Ayalon highway were a manifestation of that. So these little commie protesters blocked a massive highway and then were violent with the authorities. As flames and dense smoke engulfed wooden pallets and tires on the road, I watched a young man, blue spray paint in hand, scrawl his message to the prime minister in foot-high letters on the roadside wall. Hostages or revolt. Sounds like something they probably focus grouped. Even Defense Minister Yoav Gallant's public condemnation of Netanyahu's negotiating tactics, emotively calling him a disgrace, revisits previous rifts within the government. Last year, Netanyahu fired Gallant for breaking with the government over highly contentious judicial reforms before rehiring him shortly afterward. The difference is that now, Gallant and the country are fighting several wars: Hamas in the south, a hostile enemy Hezbollah on their northern border, an alleged terror threat in the West Bank, not to mention a still unpaid threat of retaliation by Iran for the assassination of a Hamas leader in Tehran a month ago. And how many times did we see false starts on that narrative? That whole Iran is going to attack narrative has totally bled out now. You can hear the language they're using. They're keeping that narrative together on life support. A still unpaid threat of retaliation. And to be clear, there is absolutely no part of this that could not have been completely made up from the beginning. These are narrative devices set in place and used to affect the same outcomes. Skipping ahead once again. How united the country's potentially powerful unions remain in the face of government pressure to keep the country running will also show which side has the momentum. Ben Gurion Airport appeared to stall early Monday before recovering flight operations a little later. Unions had already shuttered Israel's only major international hub during the massive judicial reform strikes last year. So the airport went down. Whose responsibility is that? Well, then they tell us. Does messing with critical infrastructure and the free movement of people for both personal and business reasons sound like peaceful protest? What is the justification for any of this? They're mad about reports of hostages dying. And here's a bit of conspiracy theorist hopium at the bottom of the CNN article. More days like Sunday with the nation at the febrile intersection of heartache, frustration, and anger will challenge Netanyahu like never before. He is not just up against his usual enemies, the country's liberal left, but in a fight-to-the-death tangle with the Hamas leader, who has made it clear that he is prepared to engage in moments of unimaginable brutality to get what he wants. For Israel, the outlook is bleak. The chances of a cathartic hostage freedom moment are fading, along with Netanyahu's political fortunes. Except here's the thing, communist propagandist Nick Robertson, Netanyahu seems like he's going to be just fine. But you're right about the cathartic hostage freedom moment fading. That's clearly never going to happen. Trump said months ago that the hostages were gone. And there's absolutely no reason to believe otherwise. That is, if there were hostages in the first place. And before we finish our extremely brutal dictator extravaganza, let's go to Turkey, a NATO member, where in the streets of the southern city of Izmir yesterday, American military personnel were assaulted by anti-Israel protesters who also blame the problems on the U.S. Now, videos of these incidents went viral on social media, and my first reaction, honestly, in seeing these videos was, oh, wow, that looks completely and totally fake and staged. Now, I can't say I know that to be true, but the reports say that no American military personnel have been injured, despite being viciously yelled at. One of them was even jostled, and a bag was momentarily placed over his head. Chants of Yankee go home were heard. Just a harrowing incident. Also, according to the Al Mayadeen news outlet, on Monday night, Turkish political groups assembled at the entrance of Izmir port to voice their objections to the arrival of the USS Wasp, a U.S. naval ship sent to support Israel. Protesters waving Palestinian flags and holding banners with messages like, "Our country's ports cannot be supply and logistics points for murderers," and "We do not want the U.S. ship that brings war and death to Palestine in Izmir," chanted slogans such as "Down with Israel," "Down with NATO," "Down with USA." They demanded the immediate departure of the American warship from Izmir port while commemorating Palestinians who have died in the U.S.-backed war in Gaza. So we are being told very clearly the Turkish people don't like us. If we go to Turkey, we could be beaten. Therefore, we should not like Turkey. Now, why would we be told all of these things? There's always an answer. And yesterday that answer came from Bloomberg. Turkey bids to join BRICS in push to build alliances beyond West. Oh, so that's why. Turkey has formally asked to join the BRICS group of emerging market nations as it seeks to bolster its global influence and forge new ties beyond its traditional Western allies, according to people familiar with the matter. And apparently now the definition of emerging market nations is any country that is not a colony of the global regime. It's crazy. They represent more than half the world's population and half the world's economy. And more countries are coming on board all the time. At some point, you have to imagine there will be a Donald Trump BRICS deal. It's just about a common currency of foreign exchange, and that may well end up being Bitcoin, so that countries can all have their own individual currency, but that these international trade deals, particularly for energy resources, are settled in Bitcoin or a currency pinned to Bitcoin. It's speculation, but it seems like that's where this is headed. From the Bloomberg article, the view of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's administration is that the geopolitical center of gravity is shifting away from developed economies, according to the people who spoke on condition of anonymity because they aren't authorized to comment. The country's new diplomatic push reflects its aspirations to cultivate ties with all sides in a multipolar world while still fulfilling its obligations as a key member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, they said. The article quotes Erdogan. We do not have to choose between the European Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as some people claim. On the contrary, we have to develop our relations with both these and other organizations on a win-win basis. And that, my friends, seems to be the emerging ethos of this BRICS coalition. Or in the bigger picture, this understanding, and maybe you could call it an alliance of sovereign nations in this emerging multipolar world. This also happens to be the natural product of Donald Trump's America First agenda. America thinks of America first. Every other country should think of their own country first. And because countries have things that other countries want, and because they want some sense of security based on shared incentives, it's the ethos they must have. It's weird that so many of the world's very brutal, authoritarian, socialists now promoted to communist dictators have such a sensible approach to foreign relations. It's quite the change from the global regime's policy, which is overthrow and control nations through the complete and total control of global propaganda media and the complete and total control of world finance and economy through the global regime's fiat currency currently branded as the American dollar. And if ever that proves not to be enough, well, the American military is always there as the world's police force. I gotta say, I think the very brutal dictators are getting it right. The good news is that according to the very same people calling all of those leaders very brutal dictators, Donald Trump is a very brutal dictator too. Seems like things are going to be okay. All right, so tomorrow is Wednesday. The interactive live stream for paid subscribers will begin at 6 p.m. Eastern. That link will be sent out in a Substack blog post sometime probably tomorrow morning. And as for this podcast, I will be back on Thursday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com, and for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/I'm your moderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the rain.